Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will get started. I'd like to welcome you all here on this very special occasion. And we're honoring Trevor Gunn's 25 years of teaching at Georgetown in the CERES program, continuously, not a break any year. We're very fortunate to have had you teach generations of our students. We won't count how many. And you have a very loyal following, you know that, so we're really delighted. And you've helped many of them get jobs in the private sector after they take your class, which is one of the other great advantages of having you teach here, as well as all of your knowledge. And your course, Business Dynamics in Eurasia, is quite unique, and I know we're going to talk about that a little later in the way you teach it. So let me give your formal introduction to the audience. I'm sure all of you know Professor Gunn, but just to remind you, and I'll give you the short version because the long version will eat away from the rest of our discussion. He's the Vice President International Relations for Medtronic, which is the world's largest medical technology company. He was formerly longtime director of the Commerce Department's Business Information Service for the newly independent states, BISNESS, as the acronym is, which is a clearinghouse for U.S. government information for doing business with the former Soviet Union. And he is, of course, an adjunct professor also at CERES, received his BA from the University of San Francisco and his PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. He's very actively involved in a number of different professional organizations, and I'm not going to list all of them, I'll just highlight a couple. He's a member of the board of directors of the USRussia Business Council, and he's vice chair of the Executive Council on Diplomacy, and he also serves on the advisory board of the University of Minnesota Carlson Business School's Carlson Global Institute. So, we're going to have a conversation for a while, and then I'm going to invite questions and comments from the audience. So, let me find my first question here. Okay. Let me ask you about your personal trajectory. Start off with that. How did you first get interested in the study of this region? And how did you begin your professional career after you got your PhD?
Well, so I guess I'd start with saying that I was an exchange student when it wasn't popular to be an exchange student. When there was no internet, when the student exchanges that you think of as commonplace, particularly at universities, were not so commonplace, and particularly not at high school. So I was sitting in San Francisco, which is a land far, far away from all of this, and decided to apply to the Youth for Understanding program, which was one of the big exchange programs. It's teetered on non-existence many times since its onset, and I was an exchange student in Sweden 1979 through 1980. And since I didn't know Swedish, I figured, throw myself into the mix, and had a good friend that had Russian heritage and decided to take Russian, and had absolutely one of the best Russian teachers. Everyone knows who's tackled Russian, how difficult a language that can be, and so he was able to really put a smile on almost every technical element. But then I guess, like many people that are involved in the region, once you get it in the blood, you can't really get it out. I think that probably so with sinologists, probably so with Arabic specialists and other people, but the same with me. So I ended up going to London. The Soviet Union ended up coming down in the middle of my PhD, which is great, and many rewritten chapters when the word processing programs were just being created. And I ended up doing a lot of that research up in the Nordic countries and looking into the Soviet Union. And at that particular moment, I was sitting in a town called Karlskrona, which is a big naval base right across from Kaliningrad. So I was literally at the sort of the apex, looking out where my wife, by the way, nearly 30 years is from. And we were looking out. You saw Kaliningrad on the other side of the Baltic. You saw the transition of Poland. You saw East Germany breaking apart. You saw the three Baltic states sort of breaking apart. So the Swedes said, wow, this is a great business opportunity. So the Chamber of Commerce of Southern Sweden founded an office called the East Europe office in Karlskrona of all places. So I started doing some database work and cleaned the floors and shined shoes and did whatever it was to make ends meet when you're doing a PhD. and ultimately came back to the United States, started at just then, so it was truly breaking apart, and people realized that it was permanent. Worked for an organization that was founded by David Rockefeller, International Executive Service Corps, for some IESC. Some of us know that, us historians around. And then, because I was commuting back and forth to Stamford, Connecticut, living in a room about literally my size at the YMCA in Stamford, Connecticut, they said, oh, there's the new office on the former Soviet Union that's being founded, and they need people that know something about it. At least they need to have people that can spell these countries and know where they are on the map. Because, so Barbara Hackman Franklin, the Republican Secretary of Commerce at that point, and Pyotr Avin, who was a prominent banker, etc., kicked a hole in the wall. They recruited a bunch of us out from the outside in. And you talked about business. We had 3 clients literally when that office opened. 3 clients, and then we built and we recruited colleagues from throughout all the countries of the former Soviet Union, even in strange places like Vladivostok or Sakhalinsk or Tbilisi or Novosibirsk or Dushanbe, all these type of places, which was a great honor to be in public service. Public service I never thought I would personally ever have, and it was a great pleasure. And then I privatized myself about 14 years ago, and the rest is history. So, try to shorten that, but that's basically the way it happened. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So, I guess the next obvious question is, what are the major lessons you've learned in your 25 years of doing business in Eurasia? And I guess what surprised you most? And which of your expectations do you think from the beginning were borne out and which were wrong?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, well, I don't need to say that this particular moment in U.S.-Russian relations is not easy. I don't think it's easy professionally. I don't think it's easy on anybody emotionally. I don't care what you know about Russia or the former Soviet. This isn't an easy time for anybody on any level. But it reminds me of the fact that maybe the number one lesson is that it's cyclical. It's cyclical. And let's remind ourselves now, if you haven't lived long enough, and particularly for the students in the room, if you just came in and you're there for 1 or 2 years, you could be forgiven to think that this is the worst time in history between U.S. and Russia. And some may actually have substance behind their beliefs on that particular point. But for me, this is not the worst we've seen. This is not a new Cold War in my particular opinion. This is very bad, and there's some new, very interesting and new elements about the situation in which we're living in. But you do see it in more or less a cycle. And so from that perspective, if you see life in cycle and you've lived long enough and you've worked in a practical sense long enough with the region, you realize that there are things that simply don't change. The variables of doing business in the region really don't change. Leaders do change, but laws and rules and regulations generally over time, maybe that's a second lesson, do actually get better for businesses. In general, these countries have moved up the the doing business in, ease of doing business in the World Bank report. So there's been great things going on in infrastructure. Great telecommunications. I mean, it used to cost us $9 a minute to call the former Soviet Union, and then sending a fax that you literally had to send it 10 times before you got the first page through. And I remember when we had our first FCS post, it was not in a physical location in St. Petersburg. As everyone knows, the consulate in St. Petersburg recently closed. But the very first consulate was actually on a boat, sitting in St. Petersburg, and we had to reach it by Inmarsat, which was $13 a minute to call. And so certainly some things have got better. I mean, we'd all love that things, and those are the lessons as well, that some things we'd like to change don't change. They simply don't. We realize that there's an elder generation around the former Soviet Union in many countries. Transparency is continues to be a big challenge. It's a challenge for everybody. It's a challenge for the populace, it's a challenge for the world, and it's a challenge for we as businesses. But the reality is, we've seen a little bit of progress. We'd also would have liked to see a lot more progress when it comes to support, not for big businesses like ours or David Short, my colleague here from FedEx, but actually for businesses that are small, where a person could actually wake up in the morning, have a good idea, open a kiosk, have a good idea, be able to bring it to market. So So the support for small and medium-sized business is often the best indicator of whether countries are doing well. And I'll leave it to you to judge whether that's really where the reason is today. I'd like to say that there may be some countries that I would think are okay on this. Most of the countries are actually doing pretty badly in the support of small and medium-sized business, and would have liked to see that as well. But on balance, I think we forget for a second the business environment is going up. The political environment, maybe not so much. We look at it from a national security perspective. You look at the region. It's I wish we would have seen more change, but yet businesses, and that is my day job, are better able to operate and fluently in the region.
Which countries are easier to operate in the former circumstances?
Kazakhstan is the country that I would point out. It's become a darling. Again, I mean, every country has its challenges, but generally has an extremely good banking system, basic infrastructure. They've gone through some of the crises, some better than others, and they've done a very good job at sending out leaders from their country, like Norway did. As an example, Norway was a new oil and gas nation, sending their young leaders to the United States, getting that training, but also coming back. I think very, very important. A country I think we should watch very, very closely is Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
Uzbekistan, people may forget, actually has gone through about a 20-year, a very difficult period. Yeah. Maybe it wasn't just 20 years, maybe it's even beyond. But that country is coming back, and it just occurred to me, Angela, because an old colleague, an old client of mine from Uzbekistan, who actually left Uzbekistan, he was the first investment banker in Uzbekistan, came by the office a few weeks ago and said, "I'm moving my family back from Buenos Aires." They literally gone, and we're going back, and it's time to look back. Not to say that some of these countries don't get a lot of great scores, maybe in the political area. I mean, Russia still is for some countries, it's a very mixed market. For companies like ourselves, they treated us very well. Healthcare as a sector, I talk to my colleagues at major pharmaceutical companies that treat us very well. However, as we go around other companies, they've had a very difficult time, particularly post Crimea, with particular issues in Russia. So it's really a mixed bag in Russia. Ukraine, I think, has its better days in front of them, and I would say they rank very high in terms of support for small and medium-sized business. And ultimately, I think it's the best barometer, if you ask me, because big businesses can often survive in almost any climate. They'll figure out a way to work. So those are a few that we may not normally think about.
That's great. We do have room up here.
That's right, the easy seats.
The easy seats,
that's right.
So feel free. Tell us maybe a little bit more about business, about how that's evolved and what it's doing now.
The organization?
Yeah, the organization. Right.
Well, the organization, so it's a great question. Well, so yeah, as you know, business kind of morphed, it disappeared because it was State Department funded. There was a perception that there was so much progress, and this is about 14 years ago, at BIS-NIS, the organization that I once had the honor of heading. It was a State Department funded program. The way I looked at it, State Department was always the chair of our board. We were operated as part of the Department of Commerce. It's morphed into more of a policy type organization, which is fine. I mean, Matt Edwards, an old colleague of many years, heads up that particular area in the department that does really a great job in that. I don't think today that the Commerce Department has the resources that they actually need to deal with the day-to-day business issues, and that means getting just objective information and putting it into the hands of businesses so they can operate. Which, when you're a small, medium-sized business, you don't have a lot of cash to be investing in a lot of market intelligence and market research, though you may have a great product and service. It's difficult to take it to market without that. But look, they do a great job under a difficult situation, and as you know, given the situation, at least in Russia, over the past couple of weeks, number 1 and number 2 of our commercial service are now back in the United States on I guess, unscheduled leave. I think it's the right way to say it. So, yeah. But that's kind of the way things stand. But I just feel in general, Angela, that you know, the vast majority of our clients at business used to be small, medium-sized. 80% of our clients used to be small, medium-sized companies. And in activities that most people can't even, I was just mentioning to a couple, Kyle, I was just mentioning to you, one of my students right now, about the you know, it's difficult to imagine all these different areas of business that small, medium-sized businesses actually get involved in. And this particular one client, he's involved in selling rail stock. You probably know who I'm talking about. One of my first students, but it's difficult to find that type of support if you're a Russian business or Ukrainian business. Difficult for an American business to partner up with that size of business as well.
Yeah. Good. All right. Let's talk about the course you teach. I know you'd love to talk about that. We want you to talk about it. It's the only one of its type, as you said, in the U.S. What are its objectives? What sets it apart? How did you dream up this idea 25 years ago?
Well, you all dreamt it up and I just did it. No, I'm joking. No, in joking, well, actually, I've tried to ensure that other people, so I've shared the syllabus with a lot of people, but nobody else has taken me up on the offer to teach it at other universities. Not as me, but been able to use that same intellectual capital. In general, I think that, and we're sitting here in the School of Foreign Service, you know, the top of its class around the United States. Fundamentally, it's a practitioner's course. It's looking at area studies programs really as a great resource for the business community. And you know, look at you, David, and Jim Regan, and other colleagues that all can imagine there is an absolute and direct link between an understanding of business environments, languages, cultures, and the ability for a business to function normally. And although that may be very, very basic, the reality is, as you know, there were really big cuts in area studies programs around the United States a few years ago, almost a rounding error. But actually, the way I look at it is they kind of cut down our bench, meaning there were public funding sources that were altered somewhat. But the fundamental business argument, and this is where the core stands, is that linguists and people that understand the region are incredibly valuable resources for business. That they should see the business community as a potential outlet for their careers. Some have chosen that. But even if you learn those business skills, you want to do something else, you want to go into NGO, great. You want to go into diplomatic service, great. Well, guess what? The president's going to tell you, like Obama said to his ambassadors, like Trump is saying to his ambassadors, business is not priority number 6 on your list. Business is very, very high on your priority. If you don't understand business, how are you going to be? So even in the public service relevant. So sort of the hallmarks, Angela, just quickly on the course, I think you probably know, but it's like I said, it's a practical course. And we're trying to teach things that in my view, are very difficult to do in any other way, which is teaching intuition. And the reason why I say that intuition is because, look, in any emerging economy around the world, and I work in all of our economies, 160 countries we have operations in, former Soviet Union is not all that different, to be honest with you. It gets a lot of bad press, and it gets a lot of dings, but the reality is, you know, these type of intuitions that you learn in the course are transferable to other places. And those intuitions are got from learning the languages and understanding, trying to anticipate your partner's moves, try to play out different scenarios, try to foresee different situations before they come, and to see a situation actually as relatively normal. When people who don't have that type of training, right, don't have language or cultural, they may actually mistake the cues. They may think. And then guess what? What happens in a negotiation is that people overreact to things. It's a typical thing I talk about. It's called the serve and return, which it's a long thing, but you can understand basically it's a really, really hard serve that is really, really surprising to the other side. And if that side is surprised, there's a great possibility for overreaction. But all it is actually fundamentally is a cultural trait, an underlying cultural trait to figure out if your dialogue partner is actually being honest with you, and to kind of get you off center a little bit. But if you don't have that type of knowledge, you don't have that language and area studies training, you would quickly misinterpret and probably be offended at it. So the type of things that we're teaching here, the type of things we've said in the course, and by the way, many professors, my guests, professors that we've had, like Bob Dudley, who the CEO of BP, who walked into our classroom one day, or Tom Pickering, or those have, and we've had several guests. We'll have Deere in a couple days. We'll have Chevron in about 2 or 3 weeks. A lot of co-professors are teaching. it all moves in the same direction, which is getting people straight on business in the form of student in a practical sense, and being able to parlay that into whatever your career path is going forward.
So one of the really important things, as you say, is understanding the culture and the negotiating style, which you wouldn't be able to find from reading books, right?
Absolutely. Well, you can get there, but it's probably about 10% effective.
I'm tempted to ask, did you have Bob Dudley before or after he'd had his little problems
Yeah, so that's
with the Russians when he
No, so
the TNKBP?
Well, so there were
Yeah.
a lot of big events. When I say Bob Dudley, everybody understands today, presently, the CEO of BP.
Yeah.
So there were two big events that I was
Right.
kind of slightly attached with in Bob's life. And first was,
Yeah.
actually, I was in a Washington International Business Council briefing, sitting right next to Bob, and I said, weren't you basically underground for a long time? Because I'm looking at case studies with you on it, and I said, why don't you come over to Georgetown and tell your story? He's like, yeah, when? Because his family was in Annapolis, and that was great. And so very nice. We got some cookies and coffee out and sat with him, and the students loved him. The most modest person that you will ever find. I hope you agree. I certainly, you would never. But then, so he was executive vice president, board secretary for BP at that stage. But then, about 4 weeks later, another big event happened for BP. As you know, a little bit of an accident in the Gulf of Mexico. And as you know, the CEO of BP at that particular moment did not get a lot of flowers for his reaction to the crisis, and they needed somebody that they felt that they could trust. And Bob became CEO after that particular event, about 4 weeks after he was by our class. So that was fun. Yeah, that was fun. But I think he's the same guy today.
Oh yeah, definitely, and still operating.
Yeah, right.
Despite everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the students that we have in our program, although not all of them, and students in other area studies programs don't always see their future in the private sector. And I think obviously one of the important things your course has done is to show them that's not true. So how successful do you think you've been in getting the students in our program to sort of think about the private sector as a career?
So it's a great question. Let me talk about that in maybe two parts, Angela, if I could. So have I been successful in educating them on the business mindset?
Yeah.
And how successful have I actually been in putting them in the private sector?
Two different questions.
First of all, the first is, to be completely frank, the students should comment on that, not myself. But I would say, I would think that at the end of the day, most people say that they exited the course with a greater degree of confidence and a greater degree of practical understanding, and that their fright level around dealing with businesses and dealing with things that even myself, I'm not terribly comfortable with, like financial issues. That they are able to admit that and kind of get to the practical issues and get to learning this stuff. Like at the end of the day, being able to say I don't know is a really, really powerful type thing here and elsewhere. And so from that perspective, I think I've done a better job. On the second part, it's often that we don't know. But as some of the students, Yue is here in the back. She's looking at her device. Kyle is here. I'm trying to think if there's anybody else from my present students. Oh, hi, Grace. Good. So good. We had one of our speakers, Mate Kenda.
Mm-hmm.
So Mate worked for a big oil and gas company by the name of Freeport McMoran, and it was the first. So we have non-disclosure agreements, so we can't go into the substance of what they looked at, but everybody understands this is a major American oil and gas and mining company. So they did a plan for one of our clients, and about 18 months ago, he said, by the way, we haven't been in touch for a little while. Did I tell you that I actually got a job at that same company on the plan? I'm like, that only took you 6 years to say. And then I realized life is busy, so I don't know if And I was actually one of the greatest things. Actually, he came back to the class earlier this term, as our students know, and he was able to kind of give right back. And by the way, he's been a repeat client of our class, again under non-disclosure agreement. You know, so it's nice to see that life cycle, Angela. I can't say at the end of the day. You know, on the second, because I don't really have a mechanism by which I could really track it. But I think that we have a fair track record there. Probably have a better track record than the first.
Yeah, and I know you've also helped students who are in your course to then get internships that sometimes lead to jobs, and even if they don't, they give them skills and new knowledge that they didn't have before. So,
I think that's the issue. There is a certain discipline around the business mindset. What does it give you and what doesn't it? Even be it memo writing, be it these literally 1-minute presentations that we have to give, whatever. It's just these disciplines.
Yeah.
They're useful in so many other different contexts, right? The one-page memo, and that may be all sort of common sense, starting with the conclusion, which is not necessarily the academic way. Those type of things, all those type of skills are transferable to I can't think of a situation where they're not really transferable. At the end of the day, you have to speak and operate in the context that you end up in. Be it an NGO or other, you may not want to write in that type of style, but then you have the skill set and you can, it's just like, what's the most popular language in the world? The most popular language in the world has nothing to do with statistics. The most popular language in the world is the language of the client, right? Adapting yourself to that particular situation, and you may not want to play that card and play that skill set in all situations. Not so much here. So.
And your students do some business plans too, I gather, too.
I have a stack, very, very high, of business plans from literally the
25 years.
Yeah, 25 years. No, so we only started this, by the way. And by the way, this was before business schools actually did business plans. And that's incredible to think like that. I just thought it made sense because everyone has limited resources. They all have bigger ideas, and they actually have money to invest in real market research. And to be completely honest, students generally are able to capture sometimes 70 to 90% of what the fundamentals of what the businesses actually need. Particularly small, medium-sized companies that will never invest big dollars in the McKinseys or the PwCs or whatever it is. So that's been great. So we've had literally probably 50 of the top Fortune 100 doing plans, but the ones I have to say that I'm the most proud of, and I think that we should be the most, are the ones that are small, medium-sized companies. And you'd think that the students all went, like this year we had 18 proposals, but we only had 3 business teams. So I'd say 15 to 15 companies, sorry, the student didn't choose you. Some of the students chose an entrepreneur. They love entrepreneurs. They don't always go to brand names. And you would think that, this is a brand name, I'm going to put it on my CV. One of them, a team chose a Ukrainian crazy entrepreneur. They are learning so much more than I think that they realize how difficult that might be, how rewarding it is. But when you're running a small business, I help my wife out with her business on the weekends. It's a 1 or 2 person business. You learn about every aspect of the business. You can't say I don't know, and that's the most rewarding things because you can see those. There was one firm out of Wisconsin actually that wanted to do honeycombs in Ukraine, a 3-person firm, and the students picked it 2 years ago. I'm like, well, this is great, honeycombs in Ukraine. Who would have known? That's wonderful. It's great that Boeing wants to do a plan, and we all understand, and we love Boeing too, but I think the most valuable are the small, medium-sized companies.
That's great. Okay, so now I think we're going to turn back for a few moments to the broader questions of U.S.-Russian relations. You started to talk about that. As you say, they're probably not the worst that they've ever been, but they're certainly the worst that they've been since, let's say, before Gorbachev came to power. We can obviously think about times before that when they were worse. As I say, you started to answer that. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that. That, if people talk about a Cold War 2.0, which may or may not be right, in politics, that presumably is not extending to the business. In other words, you can still have the commercial relationships going on even in this, much more hostile political climate.
Absolutely. And you know, it's, in a certain sense, I feel like our relations are hanging off a thread. In a certain sense, I feel like they're a lot more stable than all of that. But when so that our relations are hanging off a thread, I'm told by U.S. government employees, and work in the EU a lot as well, that business is pretty much the only communication channel. Business and academia are really the only communication channel that are tying the nations together. That is frightening. Not great.
Yeah.
Businesses are good, but at the end of the day, we have fiduciary duties. We're proud Americans, but at the same time, we have fiduciary duties to our own companies and to our shareholders, and it's very difficult to sort of balance those interests. At the end of the day, we need to work for the people that pay our salaries, and that's very, very important. We do like to play that extra role, and I think, you know, particular sectors, academia, health, aerospace, as an example, you know, we really have to feel this extra duty to keep things together and to keep things flowing. So we do a fair amount of shuttle communication for things that are still working. There are incredible voids in the communication between the two countries, which is extremely saddening, both honestly professionally, but also emotionally. For us that really believe in the potential, really see the forms of it, look at that science, look at that incredible potential, look at the region. It's incredible that we have to be in a situation like this, and we're going to continue to hope. But in healthcare, we've been incredibly blessed. We have very, very strong relationships with the Russian government. It's not an endorsement of the Russian government. It's not a criticism of the Russian government, because our clients are health, our clients are patients, our clients are the public health care systems, and you know, grandma and grandpa might be making political decisions, but that's none of our business. We're supposed to be operating in every country in the world, and U.S. law, even in Iran or Cuba or other such places, allows us under license to work in those particular areas, and we exercise our rights and our duties to those citizens to do that, and also our fiduciary duties as companies to sell in those particular environments. So we can, you know, but again, I think that people are talking more than they actually are, but sometimes I'm reminded that I may be optimistic.
So, you know, you mentioned before that Kazakhstan's one of the countries that's easy to do business with. Certainly on a political level, right, you talk to Kazakhs, and the deteriorating US-Russian relationship they feel does affect them and worries them. Do you find that in other post-Soviet countries where you're doing business, that even the people doing business there are concerned about this deterioration, even if it doesn't necessarily impact your business with them?
Well, I mean, Russia is such a, so if you look at the U.S. trade relationship with Russia, Eurasia, the former Soviet Union, so the CIS states, Russia is still 70 to 80% of that trade.
Yeah.
In the bigger picture, it's only 1 to 2% of global trade. So I guess, you know, Russia has an over influence in the region. Everyone is afraid of this. Just like people in far off locations in the world are actually very much afraid of the deterioration in U.S.-China relations, or these interesting new discussions we're having with China because of the pervasive. And I think they're back to Russia. I think people are very afraid of it because, I mean, you've got the whole periodic charter there. You have nuclear weapons. You have a lot of different things. Actually, you do have some aligned interest actually with where we are, despite some of the recent events. There are a fair amount of aligned interest, and that we don't take good advantage of those. But yes, people in all the countries are worried about U.S. and Russia not getting along. Does it, at the end of the day, disrupt their decision making and/or execution upon those decisions? It does affect decision making because, let's be honest, in most places in the United States, people think the whole former Soviet Union is just Russia. As much as I wish that weren't the case, they don't think of it as 12 separate countries. They think of Africa as one country, you know, not 54 countries, those type of things. And that really damages because, you know, in Skokie, Illinois, or in, you know, Des Moines, Iowa, or you name the area, every day they're glued on CNN, they're opening up the local paper, and every single bit of news is bad, and they're not comparing kind of where we are on the map and this type of thing. It pervades the overall pervades the overall environment. Execution is not easy, but I don't think it is as difficult. If you've got a good product and a good service, I don't care if you're a small, medium, or large company, you can usually get that. You can figure out a way, figure out your distribution, figure out a way to get the services into the market, even if it means selling that product to an export trading company here in the United States and getting them to kind of take the risk over there. You can usually try to get, it's in areas where the area where Russians think or perceive by fact or fiction that they actually can produce it. Or there's natural monopolies and those type of things that you're going to get a lot more regulation, a lot more pushback. But fundamentally, if you have like medical technology like we sell, there are really no Russian competitors. So if you want good health care, you can come to us, you come to Abbott, Boston Scientific, you come to anybody, but at the end of the day, you're going to be buying medical technology from usually the United States and or Western Europe. But that's not the case with many other sectors. They do have options, and certainly there's pressure to present more localization type programs. Yeah.
So now I'm going to ask you one slightly more professorial question about your experiences. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, right, many people in the West believed that it was important to encourage Russia's economic integration into the West because that would affect its political behavior and the kind of the way it looked at the world, and really it would encourage them to establish the rule of law if they wanted to be much more economically integrated into the West. So now we have a situation where Russia is economically integrated into the West, but obviously they haven't established the rule of law, and they're taking sort of hostile actions against the West and having them join the WTO, right, where we believed you want to have them in a rules-based system might somehow moderate the way they approach things. So we know what happened in Russia, but I'm interested in your comparative experience with Medtronics because you operate in so many other countries, including, I'm assuming, China. Is Russia an outlier here, or is that sort of, in general, probably the wrong way to think about things, that kind of economically integrating countries will also affect their attitude towards rule of law and sort of general relations with the West?
No, that's right. I mean, to your very last question, I think we're all specialists. I consider myself a Sovietologist, or at least consider myself that I've spent most of my time trying to understand the countries that used to be the Soviet Union, and so we that are asked to focus, we often don't have global perspective. And I think that one of the nice parts of my job is I started a function because we were expanding in the former Soviet Union. Then they said, "Oh, okay, good. You're doing okay. Now do emerging markets." And then the next thing is you're doing okay there. Do the rest of the world. So it does give you different perspective. And I've had to learn Latin America, I've had to learn Africa, and obviously places in Asia. I was a kind of sinologist freak, so I did know a little bit about China. But you're forced in a position to really learn and really do these very exacting comparisons, just like you mentioned. So I do think that actually Russia and the former Soviet Union is in a much broader family of nations that are very difficult to do business in, that have transparency issues, that don't really rank well on the transparency index. But one thing most of those other countries don't have is a lot of back history with the United States and a lot of back perceptions. Generally, most Americans probably would say they don't really have any direct association with China in the way that we've had in socialism. Maybe they grew up, and I think it's a passing generation as well, but you don't have a lot of baggage. So I do think that that's the case. Back to the issue of, has the business created a better rule of law? So there are oodles and oodles of laws that never existed. And that's not a problem. There's certainly jurisprudence that's been built over time. All that is, I consider to be legal infrastructure that didn't exist, and trained judges in the way that we would. But I would reflect on my dear colleague, the late Sarah Carey, who was a dear friend, who I always looked up to as kind of the dean of the discipline. She passed about 4 or 5 years ago, and she would probably be quite unhappy about the situation in which we find ourselves, because she would always mention this issue of judges finding as much in sort of in an objective way for Western companies, as you know, and was really celebrating, really with every moment, the progress in the system. Things have gone a little bit the reverse direction. Certainly so. But back to business's role in all of this. Had business not been there, and remember, it's the expansion of Russian business abroad as well as Western business there, right? And it's certainly bidirectional and certainly all over the world. You know, you go down to Brazil, you see Lukoil. You know, it's all over the world, right? Russian business is truly global. You said moderate, and I think that's the right way. Businesses act to guide and moderate and modify, but ultimately has not been very successful in giving political direction, you know, macro political direction to countries. And I would also say that I don't think that that's business's job to do that. At the end of the day, that's for other people. We can be helpful. We thrive in more open economies, generally speaking. We like more democracy, but at the end of the day, I'm not Russian. I didn't go through World War II. I didn't go through the experiences that Russian citizens have gone through, and it'd be wrong for me to be judgmental about that. And ultimately, we deal with multiple political systems in the world where we actually fundamentally, behind closed doors, we're swearing all the time about all the problems that are going on in these countries. And from that perspective, if we're going to make decisions based only on political systems, you know, our mission doesn't go much further than Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is where we were founded, and that's wrong. Wrong for us as a business, wrong for us. But we want to play a constructive role in that discussion and give a broader reason why the rule of law should continue to be respected and continue to be built upon, and that laws that just exist are actually followed.
So final question, and then we'll throw it out to the audience, and you can say as much or as little as you want on this. What do you think is the utility of sanctions against either individuals or companies?
So some of these questions I expected, some of them I didn't. Angela's my boss. What can I say?
No, as I say, I mean, you don't
No, it's
have to
great.
answer
No,
if
I
you
love
don't
it. I
want
love
to.
it, Angela. So not a question. Utility of sanctions. I guess it depends on from what perspective you look at it. I think that thinking about process for a second here. And I'm very much independent, no allegiance to any political party, so you understand this. I think that people were very thoughtful in the Obama administration, and really thought through their decisions, and we had many discussions with them at USRussia Business Council and other about how to make it. And they really thought through what they would do and how they would do it and minimize damage on, for example, economic assets and U.S. competitiveness. And I think that's not unlike some of the same people that we've actually talked to even in this administration, particularly civil service folks. Are they actually useful? I know that's the question, and I'm kind of steering a little bit clear of them. I mean, I don't know if it is. I mean, we've had a new round come out this week. It's got closer and closer to people that matter in Russia. I don't know. One thing is very important about Russia, I think that everybody really understands this, that Russians can probably suffer, and their tolerance for pain is much greater on average than almost any country in the world. And people have to understand that. I think that people don't recognize the ability either for Russians to be entrepreneurial. When you've got a crisis, when your stock market, like in 1998, goes down 90%, I didn't say 9, I said 90%. I think many countries, those investors would, line up on Golden Gate Bridge and call it a day. That's not the case in Russia. They rebuilt, they moved forward. So I just think that we have to factor that into what we think is ultimately going to be the case. I don't think this is just it could be the beginning. I hope it's the beginning of the end. Some people say it's the beginning of the beginning. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that the Russians are really hunkered down, and I think it's these sanctions have made them more self-dependent, certainly more self-confident. I don't think they've damaged public opinion. That seems to be the case from the Russian perspective. How they damaged U.S. The sanctions have damaged U.S. industry, absolutely damaged U.S. industry, but from both political parties. There's no question about that. But American businesses survive. Thank God we've got many markets in the world, and we're gonna see a new tomorrow. Yeah, it has, but hopefully these are just tactical setbacks as opposed to anything more strategic.
Great, thank you. So the floor is now open. Questions, comments? Please identify yourselves.
Criticisms?
Disagreements? Yeah.
So since the Soviet days, which industries in Russia, in that region, would you think that Russia is catching up, at least slightly, or very well with the West versus continues to lag? Obviously, military is probably number one that I would think of, but less obvious ones that you would maybe mention?
Software? So what I mean by software is not the software that, well, Kaspersky Labs comes to mind, right? And I know that there's been a lot of discussion about Kaspersky Labs and whatever they are, but I'm an old programmer, so I'm not thinking in political terms when I say that. I'm just simply raw computing skills and able to translate those raw computing skills into a marketable, understandable product on the outside. So I think that's an area where, by the way, multiple versions of Microsoft Office have been programmed in Novosibirsk. How many people knew that? So I think that's an area. The programming area is really, and these can be. How many Russian-born entrepreneurs do we have out in Silicon Valley? Let's remember where they were born. Let's remember where Sergey Brin was born. Okay, I mean, there's no lack of brain power, and so the issue is lack of marketable skills and packageable. So I think that's aerospace in general. I think it's just the aerospace industry in general is something that. I mean, Boeing does a lot of their sourcing of titanium, right, on the metals front, but at the same time they have a design center, and best I understand, they haven't cut back all that much. They're still doing what they do best, as an example. So I think that it is nonetheless a frustration, a huge frustration for I think Russian citizens, and rightfully so, that they can't put all that great brain power that usually like 1, 2, or 3 in terms of advanced science, that they can't put it better to work in terms of products that fly and that you can buy and that you can understand and touch. Yeah. But those are some of the ideas there. But that's far away from I think what their potential is. I think it will be very interesting to figure out if these sanctions continue or get harder, and it's a forced, if you will, self-dependency. What new interesting competitive industries will come out of that? Will there be new companies, new industries that actually come out of that? I actually think, however strange this actually may sound, the finance industry is a very interesting area of competence for Russians. They're great traders, right? They're great traders, and so there are nefarious ways to utilize those skills, and there are more productive and legitimate ways to use those. And I think we've seen both. And I think we've seen both, but I think that's an area where ultimately that it could be a very interesting area. We've seen a fair amount of companies popping up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry to come back to an example for Medtronic. Most people don't know, and look, I mean, it could be Ukraine, it could be Russia, actually, from this perspective. We have about nearly 300 programmers in Lviv and Ukraine. Very interesting. So we manufacture 168,000 medical devices, and these are very, very scary and very sophisticated devices. These are not gauze pads. These aren't basic technologies. So these are things that actually stimulate the brain to, like Parkinson's type technologies, or insulin pumps that we're the largest producer of. That programming occurs in Lviv, Ukraine. These are very high value. Just so you get a sense, if we didn't have that type of dependency, next to David Short's industry, commercial aircraft and commercial airspace, we're probably the second most quality-oriented industry by a fraction. And so we have unforgiving, unrelenting regulators that demand and should expect absolute perfection from us. And if we did not have that type of clear and unadulterated dependence that we do on our Ukrainian colleagues, we'd not be able to move that forward. So I hope that kind of gets to some of the answer to your question. That's a little bit useful to you.
Great.
Keep on challenging me if not.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Julie. I'm a second year MSFS student. I'm curious on how the medical devices industry has changed over the years. It's become a lot more technological devices that are now connected, and so the regulations that you're dealing with are now more about sometimes data collection and privacy issues as well. I'm curious how your role in the medical devices industry has kind of changed given the larger role of medical devices. And then a quick second part is, you mentioned that maybe it's not the job of businesses to get into macro political issues. And I'm wondering if you feel the same way about internet companies that are operating.
And with no particular reference to anybody in town
Today's
right now.
the day.
Yeah, right. Okay, I got that. You're talking, so in the first question, if I could just clarify, you're talking about medical devices on a global scale in our industry writ large, not specific to the former Soviet Union. Is that right?
Yeah.
So as you know, we're the largest medical device manufacturer in the world. So just for people that don't know. Look, in the vast majority of our revenue, even as a company, are literally in the body. People don't know about it. We're a $30 billion revenue company. About 80% of the revenue is probably sitting in the body. So people don't think of the medical devices we deal with. So yes, when they're in the body, they're collecting a lot of information, very important information. And it's really important that they collect that information so that the therapy can properly deliver. If I can't measure your heart rhythm, it's very difficult for my pacemaker to tell you, how quick or how should I slow your heart down, or it's very, very practical purpose. Very, very practical purpose. It does. So you can imagine, privacy issues really start at the absolute genesis. People don't like to talk about sickness. People don't want you to know about sickness. They don't want. It's difficult even to admit to other family members that they may have sickness. So you have privacy issues there. And indeed, you don't want to talk to your employer, usually, about those things. Those are really difficult issues. So they start at really, really basic levels. So interestingly, you can actually have medical devices in your body and have absolutely no idea. I could have a deep brain stimulator literally hooked up to my brain right now, and you would have no idea that I had that. You'd have no idea that I literally was walking dead before I had this deep brain stimulator. So it triggers massive amounts of, and we do, that same information that you're talking about is communicated to physicians. You're treating physician. So that treating physician, as an example, insulin pump. Insulin pumps are for usually type 1 diabetic patients. It's usually visible because they're external to the body. And it's, if you can't transmit that information through cellular networks or Wi-Fi, it's very difficult for your treating endocrinologist, your diabetologist, if you will, to give you proper information and say, hey, you really ought to come in here. You really ought to come in like right now. No, you should be dialing 911. So we've been involved with, in U.S. law, we've got HIPAA. You've got the emergence in Europe of something called GDPR, which is the mother of all privacy regulations, and it's being executed upon right now. We have teams, legions of people focused on GDPR right now. So if you don't know what GDPR is and you want to talk about privacy regulations, you haven't seen anything until you've seen what the Europeans have put into practice. And very serious stuff, and we'll cover all the EU countries. So we're very concerned, but at the same time, people don't want to hang out in hospitals. And so the point is, we do actually want them to go home. We do want them to return to their families. We do want to have them return to work. And in order to have that person return to a productive life, we need to have communication between that patient in the hospital or a particular device. So we're very, very, very focused on those issues. When it comes to what's going on in the social media, I'm the last guy in the world that's going to ever have a Facebook account. And I'm not a social media person. I think we've had false trust in general in terms of social media in general. That's my personal, very much my personal. I totally respect that there are millennials that totally disagree with me. My class knows this because we've talked about it. I leave that whole discussion to somebody else because I don't use it. I don't really care about it. I get 350 emails a day. That's enough for me. I mean, so I'm not going to give you a good answer. I'm probably not the right generation either.
I must say, I was reading amusing accounts of Mark Zuckerberg's testimony today,
Wow.
with all these members of Congress who are, let's say, more mature, who apparently had very great difficulty understanding what he was talking about.
But I've never seen that expression on Mark Zuckerberg's face. He really looks scared. I mean, he has a stone,
Probably both sides were scared for different reasons.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
Sorry, Bill.
Bill Veal, I'm actually, some 50 years ago, I graduated from the School of Foreign Service here, and then 5 years later I got a master's in Foreign Service. And I wish I'd had a course like yours at that time. But after foreign service and then running the U.S.-Kazakhstan Business Association for 15 years, what occurred to me in this process was an understanding, the need to understand the political economies of these countries, and sort of putting yourself in the skin of the leaders of the country and seeing what their requirements are. And then you, not only do you see that, it gets to open your eyes up, but then you understand why other people behave the way they do, which is, I think, a really important skill set for a business person to understand as they go into a market. And as I would tell people when they go into Kazakhstan, you're going to create a wealth stream that's going to upset the apple cart, and that needs to be channeled so that it maintains equilibrium. And watch the process that was used to channel that to maintain the equilibrium, I think, is the thing. So I really found that was a very easy way for me to begin to sort of a key that kind of opened up a perspective for me in terms of looking at.
I couldn't agree with you more, Bill. If you asked me to comment on that,
please.
My four-wheel drive buddies would simply call the first empathy.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely correct. If you can't put yourself into the shoes of whomever it is that you're speaking with, and it's going to be a very unpredictable. It's going to be a very unpredictable experience, not an unproductive conversation.
Yeah.
No question about that. And certainly so, intuition does. That word comes back to me all the time. And hopefully our students that are taking the courses exit. That my only goal in the course is you're going to exit with a better intuition than when you started. Because the issue is that and as long as you understand the variables that could come up, I don't want anybody being completely surprised when they're asked for financing terms at a trade fair, because it's like a bazaar. It's like Eastern Jerusalem. Everyone's a friend and they're all bargaining, and what's the price of that? Well, I mean, we don't talk prices, but no, I mean, sorry, you can't just say we don't talk prices. You really need to anticipate that type of situation and have an intelligent and respectful answer. And at the end of the day, that answer actually has to take into account, Bill, as you very well know, face, which is a term that the United States does not understand very, very well. And so that has to respect that particular situation in every dialogue partner in a totally different way. So at the end of the day, teaching intuition, it ain't easy, but it's got to be done. And at the end of the day, I don't want any of our students or anybody that we're working with our students to come into situations which can't be anticipated. That they don't feel like they're in a dark alley and they don't have any way out of that situation. That they can reason their way out of a situation. They know where the emergency exit is in a particular business transaction or a particular dialogue that you have, and that's hopefully the students at the end of the term, when they're finished all their business plans and all the rest, feel that that's the objective that we've advanced. So
That's good. Yeah.
Are you able to shed some light on the process of navigating moral hazards in business in Russia and in Eurasia abroad?
So explain to me what you mean by moral hazard. I mean, give me a particular situation that you're thinking of.
Okay.
And what's your name?
Sorry, I'm Jordan. I'm a sophomore studying regional comparative studies. Also in the Global Business Fellowship. Currently in a class, Wealth and Power in Russia, with Professor Andrew Cutchins.
Yep.
And we're learning a lot about how these Russian billionaires, Ukrainian billionaires, made their first million, and it's almost always illegal. And the difficulty, in understanding is how to navigate the business climate in a way that you are adhering to American standards of legality and integrity, while succeeding in a Russian business climate.
It's a great question, and thanks very much for clarifying. Yeah, it's a great question, and we have personal experience and professional experience in that area. I think it's a much more difficult situation when you don't have a product or service that's needed or valued in whatever market you're dealing with. If you're very high in demand, then at least you have an appropriate seat at the table and a fair seat at the table. I'm thinking of a particular venture that I don't want the details of which I don't want to really go into, but where it was very clear that we had that particular seat at the table strategically. and we were very aligned. We had to align with another organization. Incredible amount of cultural similarities, but at the end of the day, we were able to do it. And it's because I think that it was a very powerful industrial interest. I think is the right way to say it. But at the end of the day, had we not been in an area that had not been medical technology, advanced medical technology, but life would have been much more difficult for us. It wasn't easy, but by the same token, it would have been a lot more difficult for us. And in particularly, one of the thoughts here is that you should avoid sectors where, excuse the expression, ladies, big boys are playing. Where you have the boulders of, oil and gas certainly comes to mind is a difficult sector. Forestry, you may not think about it, but you got a lot of very, very tough business folks there. You've got construction, which is another one of these big sectors. You got the power sector. You got rail. You got some big former and big industrial interests. Some of which were owned by former Soviet companies, like and those are areas that it's going to be very difficult if you don't have a really needed product, or if you can't feel like you have a fair seat at the table. You probably should just think of other markets. And that's not specific to Russia. That could be many other countries in the world. Where you look at what's going on with China. I can draw a quick. We medical devices industry are on the list of strategic industries that China wants to have localized by 2025. So we're smack in the middle as an industry, not specifically us. We just happen to be the largest player in that industry, where we're having that exact. As you say, not exact, but we're having difficult parts of that discussion where there are bigger interests. They may not be exactly in the form of others. And so it comes down to, can you be yourself, and can you adhere to your own standards or standards of your own company? So you should never change yourself as an individual or professional. You should never give in to those things as an individual or a professional, ever. Figure out another market, figure out another profession, but get the hell out of there. There's nothing, it's not worth your life, it's not worth anything, and it's not worth your soul to sacrifice for such a thing, because particularly if you're young professionals. But I would just simply say you're able to act legally. Again, if you have that fair seat at the table, and if you can't act legally, you're out. We've had a recent thing happen in international law where something came down, and I won't go into the detail. It's not if and or but. It's like out. We're strict adherence to the law. We as a company have to be strictly compliant with all of our international obligations, legal and otherwise. Life is just way too short, as an individual or as a company, to even have a debate around whether that's the right decision. You're just out. Figure out a different profession to get into. It's just not worth it.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Michael Rundelman. I'm a first year in CERES. So the countries in this region, they inherited the Soviet healthcare system with all of its peculiarities and particular interests and incentives. And they've kind of gone on their different paths of reform since then. To what extent do you find dealing with clients such as hospitals in this region to be unique in comparison to the global experience?
Yeah. No, in what you said, I loved what you said in the beginning, which is very different. Let me do a strange comparison with Africa. On your very first comment, you talked about Soviet Union, that we bequeathed a lot of the Soviet traditions. The beauty of Africa, by contrast, is that they don't have a lot of things. They don't have a lot of baggage coming from the past. They don't have a lot of things that they need to unwind. They don't have to, and you can imagine each one of these, operating in whatever organization you are, is incredibly complicated from an HR perspective, organizational perspective, and so you have to unwind so many things sometimes when you're operating in these particular environments. It's very, very difficult. In healthcare, I think it's the only sector of the economy where the president's actually admitted that it's more complicated than he might have thought. I don't know if you all heard that. If I heard that, maybe I was imagining it. Right? So healthcare is complicated no matter what it is, and a hospital environment is really, really difficult because you're dealing with life and death all the time. Right? It's not I could take 1 year less education, but honestly, I'm not so sure I would accept it less 1 year less of life. And so we're dealing with incredibly emotionally laden and very difficult decisions in a Soviet environment. But the reality is, so now focusing back on healthcare. And by the way, my first comment with Africa and Soviet Union has to do with so many other sectors that they have to unwind, or you have to deal with existing infrastructure. So back to healthcare. Healthcare, I mean, Russian doctors are incredibly good. They've been incredibly isolated from modern medical technology and modern medical practice in the way that we think about it. And they certainly have been completely uneducated in management. Let's just say doctors in general are not the best managers. Do I need to say that again? You get the point in any country in the world. It's like, but guess what? They end up being the stewards of their whole healthcare system. They end up being health ministers. Don't ask me how a cardiologist who operating open heart surgery all of a sudden just became minister. I mean, I understand the trust, but that doesn't follow that they would be a good manager and a good resource allocator, or be able to view good management techniques into that particular healthcare system. And that's something that we deal with on a global basis, really. Look, there are some, but those are people that have said, look, I love my medical practice, but I understand what I also need. I don't know, so let me get in and learn it. That's the experience that we have with the healthcare system. Russia has been, as I mentioned, I can't go into statistics, but I think you'd be shocked at our growth as a company in the past, in the whole region. I mean, we have 60 people in Kazakhstan working daily with open heart surgeries. I mean, we just opened up an office in Ukraine. We opened up an office that services, by the way, to Georgia, which of course is where all good Russian cardiologists come from, Georgia. You may or may not know that. I'm a little bit joking, but there is some high degree of, like Bakaria. Leonid Bakaria is one of the leading lights, and he's certainly Georgian. We have really good experiences with the Russian public health system in general. Look, there's a lot of things you could say about press management in Russia, but one really good thing is that they've infused a massive amount of money into the healthcare system. These national centers as far away as Khabarovsk, and I was just talking to somebody just 3 days ago from Krasnoyarsk. These national, neurological centers and cardiac centers, they have infrastructure in a way that has been updated and is actually really respectful. So, look, coming out of the Soviet tradition, it's really tough. And it's frankly, when you don't know cost, you don't have management techniques like I mentioned. But I think that in general, they have been generally moving in the right direction. And strangely, there's a global debate on non-communicable disease. And you may or may not be able to predict this. But, so you realize that around the world, people think that most emerging countries are going to die of infectious diseases, which is absolutely not the case. 80% of the disease burden is on non-communicable diseases. But Russia, of all countries in the world, has played the leading light, has been the leader actually in 2 terms, actually under the present WHO Secretary General and the previous Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General of the WHO for now 8 years running has been Russian. And Russia's always looked as a leading light. You may not think of this, read the headlines. I mean, I read the stuff that you guys do, and I watch the TV that you do, but you wouldn't necessarily arrive at that they are really leaders in that. And it's because of their own epidemiological situation, that generally they're considered to have relatively good systems, and trying to move their ship to a more modern and professional system. I don't know that helps, but I did see our son in the middle there. Yeah. Our second son here.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a hand in the back there, please.
He looks like us, so he must be related. Yeah.
So what I was going to ask was about adaptability of the laws, going off of what somebody else asked before. In Russia, in comparison to other economies, like capitalist economies, you said that it was easier to do business, I think, in all or I feel like you generalized a little bit to many different countries, but I feel like in particular Soviet countries have opened up more to business, and their laws have become easier to do business with. But would you hold that to other countries as well,
Yeah.
globally?
So I think that's, yeah, so Philip, you're talking about like legal infrastructure in general, right? You know, whether laws are written by people, you know, that starts with the legal education system. If their laws are being built by people that really have grounding in the legal system, really know what they're doing, as opposed to being under undue political influence. Russia's doing, I mean, you look, and Angela, you may completely disagree with me, but in general, and I take this actually from Sarah Carey, you know, she felt a much higher degree of confidence in the amount of laws that are there, that they arrived at the right way. The problem is adherence to those laws, right? In many other countries in the world, we're literally going like, you know, if I don't want to generalize in Africa, and I really shouldn't do this, but just to give you just a general sense, you know, there is not that degree of legal infrastructure in most African countries, for example, in the areas of business in which we do business. And it's not because Africans are any less. Great individuals, great doctors. We're served in the United States by many great African doctors and great African scientists. But the issue is, to put one as an example, medical devices is probably the second leading industry in the United States, actually, from a competitiveness standpoint. But in only 2 or 3 countries in Africa can we actually point to regulatory regimes in Africa, in any country in Africa, that actually are modern in the way that we can actually work within those regulatory systems. Another example is big in our company are private-public partnerships. Russia has a private-public partnership law. They've had it. It needs to be adapted, needs to be adhered to, and you know, it's difficult to get PPPs going in this type of an environment. But at the end of the day, they have those rules and regulations. Whereas you go to many countries in Africa, we're like, the political leaders are desirous of negotiating with us as a company a private-public partnership, but we literally have to there is no PPP law at all, let alone a PPP law that actually is going to be relevant to the healthcare sector. They haven't at all. It may be relevant to roads or power or other sectors, but they just haven't arrived at our area. It's largely, I think, that in you know, around the world, we have this strange problem that we're always confused with the pharmaceutical industry. So people say, oh, it's good for the pharmaceutical industry, it must be good for you guys. Well, it couldn't be further from the truth. And so I would just simply say that I think it's not, you know, if you look at the subway case, as you know, a couple big American investors, Subway that are on our corner, right? Subway, David Gansinger and Jim Worrell were 2 of the founding partners from LA. They took the franchise to Russia. Some bad things happened to them on Nevsky Prospect. Their Russian partners or Russian owners basically took over the business, opened it up basically under the same, looked very, very same. They took it to international arbitration in Stockholm, which is, as you know, the chosen location if you have the money to do your international arbitration. They were found in their favor, but then carrying that judgment in the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce Court of Arbitration back to and getting it enforced in St. Petersburg was the problem, not the lack of law or rules or regulation, but just legal infrastructure itself doesn't solve the problem. If people don't adhere, coming out with the wrong decisions based upon political influence or other, you know, or based upon, as you were saying, an individual talking about moral hazard, you know, if they're arriving at the wrong conclusion for the wrong reasons, it's not a great day. But that happens in so many other countries as well.
Any other questions? And so we will move in a minute to the reception, but before we do, I would like to present you with just a little token of our gratitude for your 25 years of teaching here.
Thank you.
So,